So tell me when I can start the slides.
Yes. So it's recording. Okay, I'm gonna stay here. Yep. Okay, so welcome everyone. It's so good to see so many of you here at the NINSO guest talk with Dr. Paul Bernal from the University of East Anglia, where he is senior lecturer in information technology, intellectual property, and media laws. He has a very interesting background as a mathematician, an accountant, and many other things. He's an influencer on Twitter on matters of law, IT, but also Brexit, and also a prolific blogger. So if you Google him, it's going to be an interesting read. So he published last year, or 6 months ago, or something like that, this beautiful book called The Internet Wars and All, Free Speech, Privacy and Truth, with Cambridge University Press, where he has a very fresh take on the main issues around internet regulation. So he's going to talk about some of these issues here, and I'm sure he's going to give us a very honest and entertaining account. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can I start the slides now?
Yes, you can.
Get it going. Okay, here we go. I'm really glad to be here, and I was very happy to receive the invitation. I should say from the start, yes, on my Twitter account I tweet about all kinds of stuff, and a lot of it is completely, not silly so much as playing around with things, and a bit of ranting, a bit of politics, a bit of things. And one of the things that makes me do that is my sense of frustration a great deal of the time about the way that not just our government in the UK, but governments all around the world tend to get things wrong. Now, I've talked about that for a while. The book, which I'll talk a little bit about during the talk, I talk about it in relation to the internet, but actually when I speak to people in most specialised areas, they say something pretty similar, that actually governments get regulation of almost every field pretty badly wrong in one way or another. And that's one of the reasons I love Twitter, is that I can actually interact with people who are in totally different fields and actually see parallels between what I talk about and what they talk about and what they're interested in, and so on. And then similarly, parallels between one country and another. Some people imagine that there is some country somewhere which gets it right. And I certainly haven't found it. And I certainly don't expect to find it in the UK after we've got our glorious freedom from the evils of Brussels. This is being recorded, isn't it? Just got to make sure I'm on the right side of the debate when the axe comes down. So, quite a lot of what I say is very much my opinion. Some of it comes from my research, and in my book, there's a lot that is my opinion, and a lot of it is drawing on other people's research. And I should say what I really like when I come to a university like this is seeing lots of other people doing all the work that I can then feed off to come to these conclusions. Because I think that's kind of the biggest thing about this book and about what I talk about is trying to pull things together from different directions. So I'll explain exactly what I mean. There's a lot of history in what I talk about, a fair bit of psychology, some economics. I was originally a mathematician. I'm sure there are people here who are significantly better at tech than me. The main thing that I've learned is what I don't know and how to find people who do know about it to try to point me in the right direction. Anyway, why do governments always get internet regulation wrong? As I said, you could actually miss out the word internet. Why do governments always get regulation wrong? But I'm going to specifically talk about the internet. And my first question in relation to that is actually, why do governments try to regulate the internet? Now, for those people who've kind of studied this thing, way back to John Perry Barlow in 1996, Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, trying to say, you can't regulate, you have no right, you have no tech, and so on. It's a great idea, but governments always try to regulate everything. And actually our experience since, I think, has shown that in some way we do need to regulate the internet. Anyway, why do they try? Well, my argument, and it comes to the subtitle in my book, is that the main reasons, at least the main excuses they have for regulating it are related to these three topics, which are the main topics of my book: free speech, privacy, and truth. And what's interesting is when I first suggested this book to the publisher, it was before the fake news explosion in 2016. And I didn't have a chapter on fake news in my original book proposal. I had a chapter that was called at that point The Pursuit of Truth, very kind of idealistic. That changed to what I call fighting fakery in the book, because it actually, what's happened with fake news fits in exactly with what my basic theories are. And before I get on to the detail, these three, I think, are the key, and the main underlying theme of my book is that actually they're intimately and inextricably linked. And that one of the things that governments do wrong with regulation is that they don't understand that they're linked. So they do something that they think is dealing with free speech. It has an impact on privacy and on our ability to access truth. Most of the measures they do to deal with fake news, to try to get to the truth, will have an impact on our privacy and restrict our free speech, and so on. But they're all very closely connected. And if you don't understand that, but just try to deal with one at a time, you end up regulating badly and producing unexpected and often damaging consequences. So, in the last 2 days, after I'd originally put this plan, 3 things happened that I thought I was going to mention. This is Nick Clegg. This was day before yesterday. Nick Clegg claims new privacy regulations will threaten Facebook's business model as he lobbies against social media crackdowns in private meetings with EU officials. Nick Clegg, I hope some of you know that he moved from the Lib Dems to now work for Facebook. He was the champion of privacy. He's the man who killed the original Snoopers Charter back in 2012, and now he lobbies against privacy legislation. The lobbying is one of the key things. Why do they regulate badly? Because they listen to too many lobbyists in the wrong way. Then, this is today, Facebook restores Elizabeth Warren's ads calling for breaking up big tech. So this is another little story about regulation. Elizabeth Warren is standing for president in the US in 2020, and she put out a big manifesto over the weekend saying, we got to break up big tech. Break up Amazon, break up Apple, break up Google, break up Facebook, etc., etc., etc. And she put some ads on that into Facebook. And Facebook blocked the ads that she put about breaking up Facebook. She then complained, and Facebook restored the ads calling for the breakup of Facebook. And so many interesting things going on in just that story. Why is she calling for the breakup of big tech? Is it because she cares about it? Primarily it's because she thinks it's a good slogan to get her to become president in 2020. But she's right in one sense. The dominance that Facebook has over certain areas of our lives is something we should be worried about. And, going back to Nick Clegg, that also gives them a great deal of power, access to officials and so on, and to shape the regulation. And then here's the third one. This is from yesterday, and this is Tim Berners-Lee. Stop web's downward plunge to dysfunctional future. So this is one of our other messages, and one of the messages that I also talk about in my book. The sense that everything's going wrong, that we're heading for a disaster, and that society is going to end, democracy is destroyed, etc., etc., etc. Is it true? Well, that's something that I wonder about all the time, and I talk about a little bit in this book. So where do I get this title from? The Internet, warts and all. Here's the lovely picture of the book. You need to know the history of this. People know who this is? Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell. So this is where the warts and all expression comes from. And from this particular portrait, it's a little bit difficult to see in this thing. But Cromwell was having his portrait painted, actually a miniature portrait, by a man called Samuel Cooper. And Cromwell has, you can kind of just about see them, there, and there, 3 incredibly ugly warts. And when he came to the artist said, "Would you like me to paint out the warts, to paint you without the warts? Then you'll look beautifully handsome, and forever you'll be remembered as a handsome man." Cromwell said, "No, paint me warts and all. I want to be seen for who I am, with all the bad bits and the good bits together." So this is what the expression comes from. It comes from the idea that you should, to get a real sense of what's going on, you've got to look at a person, warts and all. Look at a picture, warts and all. And what I say about the internet is our problem is that we're unwilling to look at it, warts and all. Sometimes we look at it idealistically, without even thinking about the warts. Sometimes we think only of the warts. When we think that the internet is turning into a Wild West disaster, and that or Tim Berners-Lee, it's descending into chaos and so on, we're just looking at the warts rather than looking at the big picture. And I think we need to look at both. So, what does it really do? The book goes through what I think of as a bunch of myths about the internet. And I'll give you a quick overview of the ones that are covered, and then I'm going to focus on some in particular. The first is what I call the illusions of permanence. Everybody knows when you put something on the internet, it's there forever. That's what we often base our kind of decision making on. And that's one of the reasons, for example, the right to be forgotten was resisted so much. First of all, it was wanted so much because you think it's there, and then it was resisted much because we think it should be there. We think that things should be permanent. Actually, neither of those things is really true. Things don't last that long on the internet. Very often, if you try to find old stuff, you can't. And not because some evil Orwellian or Stalin type has been erasing it to try to rewrite history, but just because actually what the internet is something dynamic that is changing all the time. Then, what I call confusion over perfection. Sometimes we imagine that you can't trust anything on the internet. Sometimes you imagine that if you find it on the internet, it must be true. And again, when you look at things like editing old stuff, are you rewriting history? Is that messing with the perfect archive? Actually, none of that is really true either. Firstly, are there any historians in the room? Yeah? History is a process of rewriting history, reassessing things with new knowledge, refocusing them based on what else you know, removing the old biases of the people who were writing them in the past, changing the perspectives, finding out new information. We're always rewriting history, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm going to mention some specific history, and the historical record is not so perfect anyway. Later on, and this is the one that bothers me probably the most, and my favourite chapter is the neutrality myth. First of all, the idea that platforms are in any sense neutral is one pushed very hard by people like Facebook and Google. It forms one of the 5 pillars of Wikipedia, the neutral point of view, and yet in all cases it's completely misleading. We imagine algorithms are neutral. Well, the computer scientists here know that algorithms aren't neutral, but governments like to think that algorithms are neutral, and various people in various circumstances, they talk about organic search results and things like that. Nothing's organic, it's all not neutral. That doesn't mean that we have to abandon it, we just have to see it for what it is and understand the biases concerned. Free speech fantasies, I particularly like this one as well. Everybody loves free speech, at least theoretically, but when it comes down to it, they almost all don't. There are very few governments do not officially support free speech. Free speech is guaranteed in the Constitution of North Korea, for example. I'm not going to pass too many comments on North Korea, but there are very few states that don't guarantee free speech. And yet, when it comes down to it, do you support the free speech of people you really hate or disagree with? The current drive for regulation on the internet is a great deal about actually restricting free speech. But what we also have to understand, and this is almost blasphemous to say, is that sometimes it's right to restrict free speech. Sometimes free speech is not actually useful. Sometimes restricting free speech is necessary to encourage free speech. Now, it may sound horrible, may sound wrong, and I get a lot of trouble when I say it, but sometimes to stop a forum degenerating into who shouts the loudest and the most aggressively, you have to have some kind of regulation of it. And when I talk about that, there are certain people who get very angry with me in the kind of general internet freedom world. Misunderstanding privacy. This is kind of my history. I originally was a privacy person. People really don't get privacy. Governments really don't get privacy. The idea, for example, that you can have a right to privacy in a public place is something they find really hard to understand, and yet we really do. You can provide analogies like in a pub, if you're having a private conversation, the pub may be public, but your conversation is private. Mark Zuckerberg last week, helpfully tried to muddy the waters again about privacy by saying now Facebook is becoming a privacy-friendly place. It's not true. He tried to recharacterize privacy in a way that suited him, so that he says now that actually he's supporting the stuff that benefits him, which is not really a shock. My surveillance myths, I'd like to go into that. That's not really the subject today. The whole of our surveillance law is misconceived and misjudged based on a whole set of assumptions that we have about whether it works, whether it doesn't work, what the effects are, what the so on is. And a lot of that is connected with the misunderstanding of privacy. And then the two that I am going to talk about, how do we deal with trolls? And how do we deal with I specifically did not say fake news in my title, fakery generally. That is, intentionally deceiving people for malicious purposes. How do we deal with that? I'm going to talk about those quite specifically. So, just to mention 3 bits of regulation that are causing trouble in these ways. The EU Copyright Directive, Article 13, the new one, and I'm sure some of you know a little bit about this. It's the one time the European Commission has ever tweeted at me. I tweeted something and they were so upset about it, they did a quote tweet of me with a piece of misinformation. I had made a joke tweet about memes, and they said, "We're not banning memes. They're protected by the parody exemptions." We can go in about it. One of my colleagues has just written a whole book about the parody exemption. But the point was not that they're banning memes, but that what they're doing will automatically block memes regardless of whether they intend to. That is, it's by mandating an upload filter, that is, everything that you upload onto a major platform has to go through a copyright-based filter, potentially. It could automatically block them even if you've got the legal protection, but under the parody exemption, it'll be caught by an algorithm that can't tell whether it's legal, can't tell what the legal rights are. Now, I've had lots of arguments with lots of people about this. The point is mostly they haven't thought of the real-world consequences in fields other than the bit that they're working on. They're trying to do something generally good. Protecting copyright, I am not an anti-copyright person. Protecting copyright is a good thing in most ways. But by doing so in the mechanism that they are mandating, it has knock-on effects in other areas. We've got a long fight to go with this still. It's not quite through. Everybody gets a little bit nervous when I start talking about pornography. You may be aware that to access pornography in the UK very shortly, you are going to need identity verification in some form or other. These particular proposals, they're not just proposals, they're inaction, are potentially the worst bit of internet regulation anywhere in the world for many years. And the consequences of the genuine and heartfelt desire to protect children from damaging material are potentially for our privacy substantial. If you have to put yourself on a database that identifies you as somebody who likes pornography, there are certain implications from that might be damaging. And I don't know if you know the porn ID cards that will be for sale in newsagents, apparently. If you can imagine the market that will develop in those, again, it's going to be quite interesting. And the third one, which is the one I'm going to talk about now mostly, is the current drive to regulate social media. And we've had a series of government reports that are all pointing in the same direction. We had the DCMS Disinformation and Fake News report a few weeks ago. We had, even before that, the Cairncross review of news. And then this week we have the House of Lords report on internet regulation. They are all pointing towards the idea of setting up a kind of off-int or off-net, like Ofcom, but for the internet. And the main drivers for this regulation are these twin problems. Trolling, and I'm deliberately using an unhelpful term when I say trolling, and fake news. Those are the things that we're bothered about. So, trolls. A few pictures for you to recognise. Anyone recognise this particular troll? It's my favourite troll. From the Norwegian film Troll Hunter. And if you look very carefully, you'll see there's a human figure down there. It's enormous, that troll. Evil, huge monster that eats people. Here's another kind of trolling, and this is shamelessly nicked from Wikipedia, that reliable source. This is trolling as fishing. And trolling in its original, one of the original names was named after a kind of fishing where you dangle a line behind your boat and hope that somebody bites. Hope that some fish bites. And the original internet trolls may have been named after that. Now the trouble is, you want to fight these because they eat people. You're not too keen on these because they just cause a huge amount of nuisance. But the result is, you kill all the cute trolls who are just ordinary people doing ordinary things. And almost all of the regulations to deal with that and that end up mostly getting that. So, here's a troll. Sorry. People recognise who this is? Milo Yiannopoulos. Yeah, King Troll, as he was called, organised, massive, misogynistic trolling attacks on large numbers of people, was the key behind the attacks on the Ghostbusters remake a few years ago and various other things, also photographed with Nazis amongst other things. Currently, apparently $2 million in debt and trying to sell off his goods because he was banned from various different places. He didn't troll himself. He encouraged other people to troll and organised kind of trolling armies to get people. He didn't do any of the normal offences that we would put in for trolling that get caught by things like our Malicious Communications Act and Section 127 of the Communications Act. He encouraged other people to do it. Not directly. How do you get guys like that when actually you work on a legal system that's really based on specific offences happening? It's not really conspiracy, it's not really any of these things. Very hard. Here's another one. Some people might recognise this woman, Brenda Leyland. She was a McCann troll. That is, she was part of an internet community that was didn't believe that Madeleine McCann, the toddler who disappeared in Portugal, actually disappeared, but believed that her parents were in some sense responsible for her death. And in one of the various mainstream media anti-troll campaigns, she was tracked down. This is Martin Brunt of Sky News, who found out where she was and doorstepped her, and 2 days later she died. She was found dead in a hotel room because she was she committed suicide. Why? Because actually many trolls are vulnerable, disturbed people actually doing stuff that they think is good. She didn't think she was a troll, she thought she was a campaigner for good stuff. Milo Yiannopoulos didn't think he was a troll. He thought he was fighting against the social justice warriors who are undermining society. If trolls don't think they're trolls, then our regulation against trolls, they don't think it affects them, and it's not going to actually be able to get them. She went by the name Sweepy Face on Twitter. She thought she had anonymity. She was effectively outed by Sky News. They found out who she was. So, how do we, in regulatory terms, try to deal with trolls? Well, a number of techniques. First of all, the idea that we should use real names on the internet. And this has come up again and again in every review we have of internet regulation. Only two problems with real names as a solution. One, it doesn't work. And actually there's evidence that trolls are more aggressive if they're on platforms where they use their real names than if they don't. Empirical evidence to demonstrate that from the single largest study of this area. The other is that it catches a whole bunch of people who makes victims of people who need protection, whether they're whistleblowers or people who have enemies of some kind, whether they're dissidents in an oppressive state, or they're people who have aggressive ex-partners and things like that. Having a real name, being forced to use your real name actually puts you at disadvantage. It also allows things like ethnic and religious biases to come through. If your name reveals your name does reveal things about you. If you're forced to use your real name, then those things are revealed about you as well. So the next one, surveillance. More and more surveillance to catch the trolls is one of the constant arguments. And again, it might work, but one of the things that's noticeable about trolls is that they're quite clever about this stuff. And actually, the Gamergate saga is perhaps the biggest example. They are very good at manoeuvring around systems that we put into for surveillance, and actually the surveillance will get, again, the innocent people, plus all the other extra consequences of surveillance. The next one, and this is the current mode, blame the social media providers for the trolling that happens on their platform. It's Facebook's fault there are trolls on Facebook. It's Twitter's fault there are trolls on Twitter. If only they were more, if only they paid more attention, they'd be able to deal with those trolls. Now, the problem is manifold in this. One is, in some senses, even if they're right, there's a perverse incentive here for the social media providers. They've got to have their users. If they ban lots of their users, they're actually undermining their own business model. The other is, if you develop a system for reporting abuse, the first people who will use that system are actually the trolls themselves, who will report their victims. Now this goes back to the early days of the internet and the flame wars that some people may be familiar with. You use a tool against your enemies. And as I said, they tend to be clever at these sorts of things and good at gaming opportunities, and they will do so. And we had an example of that last week, where the Corbyn supporting account Rachel Swindon got banned from Twitter for a day until they managed to complain it back, because she was being reported by people who were effectively trolling the other direction. And all you do when you put faster reporting of abuse is kind of escalate the existing conflicts. Which is not to say that you shouldn't have systems, but that it's difficult. And that, like many things on the internet, there are kind of two different approaches to how you deal with it. One, an algorithmic approach for automatically detecting abuse. And Twitter tried that for a while, where if you swore at somebody with a verified account, a blue tick, then you got an automatic algorithmically generated 12-hour ban. Now I have a blue tick, and I experimented with it, got people to swear at me, and it worked. They did get banned. But who designed the algorithm to detect the abuse? And again, if you're clever, you frame your abuse in a way that doesn't sound like abuse and is harder for the algorithms to detect. You can also goad your enemies into doing things that will be detected by the algorithms. And again, the good trolls know how to do that. Banning the trolls, well, there's a kind of fundamental problem here. You can set up an account on any social media site in a matter of minutes. Ban one account, they come in again as another. You can ban the big guys, and actually one of the things that ended up bankrupting Milo Yiannopoulos was that they banned him from one platform and then another. Stephen Yaxley Lennon, Tommy Robinson, is going through the same process at the moment. But that doesn't deal with the mass. It only deals with the top guys, because the mass you can always recreate a new thing and start attacking again. Banning the Nazis, that's one of the big things they want to say. Ban your political enemies. Now, big thing on Twitter it was for a long time, and continues to be, banning extremists. And this fits in also with the fake news that I'm going to talk about a little bit. Big problem here. Who decides what political views are acceptable and not acceptable? Now, we say, I know I don't like our government, but I don't hate it the way I hate various oppressive governments around the world, yet. Whenever things like this come up, you see exactly the same techniques being used by oppressive governments to silence their enemies and the dissenters. Setting up a thing that makes a political decision is a very, very slippery slope indeed. And all of these weapons are double-edged swords. Now, they all happen at the moment, but they're all, to an extent, self-regulation decisions made by the relevant companies. Facebook's community standards are what decides stuff. And the big change is likely to be, and I think we can't resist that, much though I would like to, that that's going to be effectively replaced by legal standards that are required. I think that's what these various government reports are going to end up with. Here in the UK. You won't have that in the US for free speech reasons, but you will have it in various other places. And it's already happening in various countries around the world. Will it work? Not much. Will it have an effect on our privacy and our free speech? Absolutely. Consequences, we're still not clear. So let's move on to the second, fake news. First thing to say, and this is some history for you, this is not a new problem. So, anyone recognise who this is? Vlad the Impaler. Vlad Cepes. I should say my wife's Romanian, so I have a vested interest in this. How did this turn into this? And the answer to that actually is mostly fake news. And I'm going to give you an example. This is a woodcut pamphlet from 15th century Wallachia, what's now Romania, of Vlad. And if you look carefully, you'll see here are his impalings, his enemies stuck on poles there, and he's... When you look at this carefully, he's got a bit of a smile on. He's enjoying his dinner while people are impaled. And there's a description of it at the top in German. This was created by his enemies in Wallachia, who were the ethnically German merchants that he was effectively supporting the ethnically Romanian population against. They had a good reason to try to make him sound bad. It was a political reason. Did this ever happen? No. There's no evidence that this particular scene ever happened. Did he impale people? Yes. There's a reason he was known as Vlad the Impaler. Tsepesh means impaler. It's like a kind of a kebab almost. But actually he was far from the only impaler. It was actually a fairly regular form of punishment in that period of history at that particular time. Was he actually any worse than many of those people? This sort of story was boosted by official records by his other enemies in the Hungarian court, in the Turkish court. He fought against the Turks a great deal, and in the Russian monasteries, because he converted from Orthodox Christianity to Catholicism. And that meant that the Orthodox people were very angry with him. And they all created stories that fed on each other to create a narrative that turned him from being what most historians now reckon was a effective, fairly harsh, but not actually particularly evil person, to being kind of the embodiment of evil in history. Vlad the Impaler. Everyone says that's the worst thing. To Romanians, he's a hero. Still, very much. He's one of their kind of folk heroes. And they don't call him Dracula in that way. Dracul was actually the surname of his family, because his father was of the Order of the Dragon, which it meant. There's the detail, you can see more. And there are a whole series of these. You can see the expressions on the people he's impaled. Here's another one. That was 15th century Wallachia. This is Cardinal Mazarin in France. And he was the subject of fake news as well. Now in France, they sang the fake news. These were called colporteurs, and they walked along the streets and they sang stuff. One of the reasons for those woodcut things was that most people were illiterate. You had the writing at the top, but you had the picture to boost it. Here, again, lots of illiterate people, so singing past it. This guy, any Germans in the room? Theodor Fontaine, famous German novelist in the 19th century. He made his money as a journalist. This is a picture of the Tooley Street fire in England, in London. He wrote a wonderful piece, first-hand account of all the horrible stuff that happened in this particular fire for a German newspaper. But he never visited England. He lied. He invented it. In Germany, in the 19th century, the telegraph had just been invented, so they thought, everybody expected to get real news from real places. But it's expensive to have foreign correspondents, so they actually employed people to make up stories, to create deliberate fake news, to pretend to be stories from the world. Fake news, 19th century German. So we have 15th, 17th, 19th century stuff, and it's all the same. And we've had many, many more ever since. The point being, you create your news to support a narrative. And you use the best means technologically available at the time. So woodcut practice in Wallachia, songs in France, and also plays, because actually a lot of Shakespeare is pretty much fake news. Printed leaflets a little bit later, newspaper reports in Fontaine's time, radio, Lord Haw Haw in our Second World War, Hanoi Hannah in the Vietnam War, television later, remember Comical Ali in the Iraq War, effectively broadcasting completely false stuff, but presenting it as though it's news. And now we have social media. And Fakebook is my particular take on this. The point I'm trying to make here, fake news has always existed, but what has changed is that the social media allows it to be more effective. The reason being, data mining can enable you to identify the issues that will resonate with people. The first fake news providers in 2016 of the new explosion were Macedonian teenagers who created news that suited Trump supporters particularly in the southern states of the US. Not because they cared whether Trump was elected, but because they knew they'd get loads of clicks and be able to make money through advertising. They were able to identify the issues through data mining. They were able to identify the targets who will be persuaded by it, and then to reach those targets directly. Now, if you wanted to spread fake news about Vlad the Impaler, it was much harder creating a woodcut, printing it on expensive parchment, then finding the right people without actually giving it to one of his allies who will arrest you or worse. That was difficult. All this is automatic in a few clicks. You can create fake news incredibly easily. On Facebook, 2 pages look very similar. You can make a page that looks exactly like a professional news source in a matter of moments. You can also not just share it with other people, but through these things, you can put it in places where they will do the sharing for you. And we have evidence that it works. And this is something else that we need to talk about. And this is where the research part comes in. Since 2016, I'm running out of time. I know, I'm going to go quickly through this. We've been studying this. First of all, people believe fake news. It's created without plot holes and it suits their standards. It actually is believed more. We've evidence that they do believe it. More importantly, people aren't actually looking for the truth. They're looking to win arguments and bolster their position. And you can find it, and it can find you, because it's pushed at you by the profiling. When you see the headlines, that actually makes other news more believable. And that means that when you do a Google search, and all you get is a series of headlines, that itself is making you more susceptible to fake news. And seeing them repeatedly increases the effect. Finally, threatening news is content to share more often. With Facebook, and I know I'm running out of time, so I'll go through this very quickly. We've demonstrated they have demonstrated they can change people's emotional state, make them happier or sadder, by manipulating their timelines. They've demonstrated they can get people to register for votes. They've demonstrated they can get people to actually vote. This is all in America. They can racially target without having your racial information. They work out from your habits what race you identify with. And by that they bypass the regulation that says you can't target by race, you target by the race somebody has affinity with. And they've done that. You can target people in their immediate emotional state. You can get them when they're most vulnerable. And Facebook has tried to do so. So, it's not just Facebook. The rest of social media uses the same stuff. YouTube is one of the main areas for this, and it has almost all the same techniques. And what's more, its algorithms can be gamed. Remember I said gaming about trolls? Equally true of this. When they remove human moderation, you find that fake news actually rises to the top. And politicians. I just want to share this one. This is Esther McVeigh, who tweeted a fake story from 4 years ago. The mainstream media had allowed somebody to print some complete rubbish about the Lisbon Treaty. All EU members will have to adopt the euro after 2020. Completely untrue. And then Esther McVeigh, with a verified account, spread it. She got a lot of abuse for it, but it got shared and retweeted all over the place before she was forced to delete it. Mainstream media, boosted by politicians, feeds the fake news. It's not just Macedonian teenagers or dodgy Russian trolls doing it, it's our media and our politicians. So, how do we deal with it? If you label fake news, you actually make people more likely to read it. If you report it, they just produce another one. If you ban the providers, they just create a new account. And if we get social media tools to get rid of it, actually they'll be gamed. There's a reason Donald Trump labels his enemies fake news, because he knows that then that can be used against it. Without dealing with the mainstream media, we can't deal with fake news, really. Without dealing with Facebook's business model, because it's the data mining and the targeting that makes the difference, not the content, we'll never deal with fake news. And we don't want to deal with either of those problems. The DCMS report didn't address politicians' role in this at all. They didn't address the mainstream media's role in this at all. They don't want to do it. So, same thing with all of this. Again, they don't want to deal with the real problem, they just want to find a solution. So, I'm not going to go through the rest of it, because I just want to mention quickly the underlying problems. They don't like complexity. Nobody does. They legislate by analogy and false analogy. The best one is the Surveillance or the Investigatory Powers Act. They wanted an itemised phone bill for the internet. So they created this thing called an internet connection record that bears no resemblance at all to the way that we use the internet whatsoever. They like dealing with one thing at a time. They like making headlines. And that's what I'm worried about with Elizabeth Warren. She's just trying to make a headline rather than doing anything serious. And they listen to the wrong people, mostly the lobbyists. And perhaps most importantly, they don't want to admit their ignorance. They find it very difficult to say, I don't understand this. I really should talk to somebody who does. I will leave it there. There are actually a few more slides, but I know I'm out of time, and the rest is really summarising where we go. I'll just leave you with one thing. I said at the beginning that one of the main reasons that they want to regulate the internet is for free speech, privacy, and truth. It was kind of deliberately misleading that, because actually I think the main reasons that they want to regulate is exactly against those. They want to restrict our free speech, invade our privacy, and restrict our ability to find out truth. And that, in the end, is the result of most government regulation of the internet at the moment. Okay.
Thank you very much. That was brilliant. We have 2 minutes for questions. So we can start there.
So, first of all, thank you. That was fantastic. And it's funny to me that you should mention the porn regulations, because that's actually what I'm writing my thesis on.